The bus rolled to a stop at the outskirts of Braxton, North Carolina, kicking up dust as its doors groaned open. Isaiah Cole stepped out, his boots landing heavily against the cracked pavement. The scent of pine and damp earth filled the air, mingling with something else, a bitter undertone of history long buried, but never truly forgotten. Braxton hadn't changed much in the years he'd been gone. The same rusted signs, the same tired-looking buildings, the same undercurrent of tension that had always lingered beneath the surface. It was a town frozen in time, clinging to the past, like an old wound that refused to heal. Isaiah adjusted the strap of his duffel bag over his shoulder, taking in the familiar sights. The old barber shop on Main Street still had the same faded red and white pole, spinning lazily in the wind. Miss Hattie's Cafe, where he used to sit with his mother on Sunday mornings, still had the same checkered curtains in the window. And yet, despite the familiarity, something was different. The weight of unspoken battles settled over this town, like a storm waiting to break. Isaiah's childhood friend, Marcus Reed, was waiting for him just outside the diner. Marcus had aged, but his sharp eyes still held the same fire they'd had when they were kids, sneaking out after curfew and daring each other to race through the abandoned train tracks. "Damn, man," Marcus said, a slow grin tugging at his lips. "Thought you were done with this place?" Isaiah shrugged. "Guess it wasn't done with me." They clasped hands in a firm shake before Marcus's expression turned serious. His voice dropped lower, cautious. "You really think coming back here was a good idea?" Isaiah followed his gaze. Across the street, a group of men sat outside a gas station, watching them. The Iron Fangs. Even from a distance, Isaiah could see the arrogance in their posture, the lazy way they leaned back, smirking like they owned the damn place. One of them, a thick-set man with a Confederate flag tattoo peeking out from his sleeve, spit onto the pavement and chuckled. Isaiah didn't flinch, didn't look away. If they were expecting him to lower his eyes, like he used to as a kid, they were in for a surprise. "They know who you are, Zay," Marcus muttered, using the old nickname Isaiah hadn't heard in years. "They remember your mom, what she stood for, and they sure as hell ain't forgotten that you left this town and came back a damn soldier." Isaiah smirked. "Good. Let 'em remember." He turned his attention back to Marcus. "Tell me about them." Marcus hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "They run everything now. Town council, sheriff's office, even some of the businesses that used to be ours. Ain't nobody fights back anymore. People are scared." Isaiah's jaw clenched. He had seen fear before, in the eyes of hostages, in the faces of men about to die on foreign soil. But there was something about the fear here that twisted in his gut differently. This wasn't fear of war. This was fear of history repeating itself. And that was unacceptable. Isaiah shifted his duffel bag. "I need a place to stay." Marcus sighed. "I got a spare room, but I want my house back." Marcus stiffened. "Zay, man, you don't." Isaiah's gaze was unwavering. "I do." A muscle ticked in Marcus's jaw, but he nodded. "All right, but just know, this ain't the homecoming you're hoping for." Isaiah already knew that. Home had never been safe, but that didn't mean he was going to leave it to rot. Not again. Not ever. The sun hung low over Braxton, casting long shadows through the cracked sidewalks and rusting storefronts. The town looked the same on the surface, small, quiet, and almost peaceful. But Isaiah had spent his life in war zones. He knew the signs of occupation when he saw them. Braxton was under siege, and the occupiers weren't some foreign army. They were homegrown. The Iron Fangs had slithered their way into power, infecting every corner of the town. Businesses that once belonged to black families had been shut down or taken over. People walked with their heads down, avoiding eye contact, speaking in whispers. Fear was everywhere, and Isaiah hated it. Marcus's truck rumbled down the dirt road toward Isaiah's family land. The house had once been a place of warmth and laughter. Now, it was nothing but scorched remains, a skeleton of what it once was. Isaiah stepped out, his boots crunching against the ash-covered ground. He crouched down, running his fingers over the blackened earth. I built this place with my mother. The thought hit him like a punch to the chest. A sound behind him made him turn. 3 men stood at the edge of the property, iron fangs. Their leader, a lanky man with greasy blonde hair and a smirk that made Isaiah's fists twitch, took a slow step forward. "Well, well," the man drawled. "Look who came crawling back." Isaiah remained silent, his eyes assessing them. He noted the way their hands hovered near their belts, not reaching, but close enough to show they were ready. "I remember you," the man continued. "You used to run around this town with that high and mighty mother of yours, always talking about change. Guess we changed things for you, huh?" The 2 men beside him chuckled. Isaiah didn't move, didn't blink. The air was thick with tension. The wrong word, the wrong movement, and this could turn bloody fast. The leader spat onto the ground. "You got no place here, boy." Marcus took a step forward, but Isaiah held up a hand. The smirk on the man's face widened. "Oh, you got yourself a little protector now? Ain't that cute?" Isaiah exhaled slowly. When he spoke, his voice was calm, measured. "Leave." The leader blinked. "What?" Isaiah took a step closer. The men flinched. "I said leave." There was something in his voice, something that sent an instinctive chill down their spines. The leader opened his mouth, then hesitated. His eyes darted to his men. And then, without another word, he turned on his heel and walked away. The others followed. As they climbed into their truck, Isaiah saw it in their eyes. They had no idea who they had just threatened, and they had no idea what was coming. That night, Isaiah and Marcus sat on the porch of Marcus's house. The crickets were loud, the air thick with humidity. "They run everything now," Marcus said. "The businesses, the sheriff's office. Hell, even some of the churches are scared to speak out." Isaiah sipped his beer, his jaw tight. "Who's in charge?" he asked. Marcus didn't hesitate. "Caleb Hastings." The name made Isaiah's gut twist. Caleb Hastings had been trouble even when they were kids. Back then, he was just another bully, drunk on the power of his family's wealth. But now he was more than a thug. He was a dictator in a small-town kingdom built on fear. "After your mom passed, he got bolder," Marcus continued. "Started pushing people out, running black families off their land. Anyone who stood up to him got handled." Isaiah's grip tightened around his bottle. "How many people?" Marcus exhaled. "Too many." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Isaiah stood up. "I'm taking my land back." Marcus sighed. "Man, you ain't got nothing to take back. They already burned it down." Isaiah's eyes were cold, unshaken. "Then, I'll take them down." The next morning, Isaiah walked through town, taking in the damage. Miss Hattie's cafe had a new owner, a white man who had never set foot in Braxton until 5 years ago. The barber shop had been turned into a private club, one where only certain people were welcome. And on the town hall's bulletin board, there was a list of unwanted businesses. Every single one was black-owned. Isaiah clenched his fists. They weren't even hiding it. Across the street, an elderly man swept the sidewalk in front of a liquor store. He glanced up, spotted Isaiah, and his eyes widened. Isaiah Cole? Isaiah nodded. Mr. Jenkins. The old man set down his broom, shaking his head. I didn't think I'd see you again, son. Isaiah's expression softened. I'm back. Jenkins hesitated, then leaned in. His voice was a whisper. You shouldn't be. Isaiah frowned. Why? Jenkins looked around nervously. They're watching. They don't like trouble. Isaiah held his gaze. I'm not trouble. Jenkins swallowed. You will be? That night, Isaiah returned to Marcus's place, deep in thought. Everything he had seen, everything he had heard, it all confirmed one thing. Braxton wasn't just under siege. It was under occupation. And that wasn't something he could walk away from. Marcus leaned against the counter, watching him. You got that look again. What look? The one that says you're about to do something real stupid. Isaiah smirked. I prefer to call it necessary. Marcus groaned. Zay, man, you just got back. Isaiah nodded. And they already tried to run me off. Silence. Then, Marcus exhaled sharply. So what's the plan? Isaiah's smirk faded. First, I find out exactly how deep this runs. His voice was calm, steady. But when the time comes, he met Marcus's gaze. I burn their whole damn operation to the ground. The night was eerily quiet, too quiet. Isaiah had spent years in war zones, and he knew the silence that came before an attack. It was the kind of silence that made your skin prickle, that set every nerve on edge. And as he lay on Marcus's couch, staring at the ceiling, he knew something was coming. The first sound was distant, just a dull whoosh, like the wind shifting through the trees. But Isaiah knew better. His body reacted before his mind fully registered it. He jumped to his feet, his instincts screaming at him. Then came the glow, a flickering orange glow from the window. Isaiah rushed outside, his heart pounding as he saw it. His mother's house was on fire. Flames consumed the wooden frame, licking at the sky like a beast set free. The heat was suffocating, the air thick with the acrid stench of burning memories. Isaiah ran toward it, but Marcus grabbed his arm. Zay, you can't. Isaiah shrugged him off, sprinting forward. He reached the porch just as the roof collapsed in a burst of sparks, forcing him back. There was nothing left to save. They had taken everything. The rage inside him burned hotter than the fire. And then, laughter. Isaiah's head snapped up. A group of iron fangs stood just beyond the tree line, their faces illuminated by the flames. And they were laughing. The leader from before, the greasy blonde one, gave Isaiah a mock salute. Welcome home, soldier. Isaiah took a step forward, fists clenched. But Marcus yanked him back. Not now, Marcus hissed. Not yet. The gang disappeared into the night, their laughter echoing long after they were gone. Isaiah watched his childhood home crumbled into ash, and in that moment, he knew. They had just declared war. The next morning, Isaiah stood in front of Sheriff Jim Rowley's desk. The sheriff was a thick man with a gut that strained against his uniform. He leaned back in his chair, chewing on a toothpick, his expression bored. You're saying someone burned down your house, he drawled. Isaiah's jaw tightened. I'm not saying it. I saw them. Rowley sighed, rubbing his temple. Look, Cole. I don't know what you expect me to do here. Isaiah took a step forward, placing both hands on the desk. I expect you to do your damn job. Rowley's eyes flickered with something like fear, but it disappeared just as quickly. The Iron Fangs, Isaiah said. They did this, you know it. I know it. Rowley took out a file, flipping it open lazily. No witnesses, no evidence. He closed it with a snap. Sorry, Cole, case closed. Isaiah didn't move. The room grew colder. Rowley shifted in his chair, suddenly uncomfortable. "I'd watch myself if I were you," he muttered. "Folks round here don't take kindly to stirring the pot." Isaiah stared him down. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out. Rowley exhaled, relieved. But as Isaiah stepped onto the sidewalk, one thought burned in his mind. The law wouldn't protect him, which meant he had to handle this himself. Isaiah sat in Marcus's garage, staring at the pile of ashes he had collected from the ruins of his house. His fingers clenched into fists. "This wasn't just an attack," he murmured. "It was a warning." Marcus leaned against the workbench, arms crossed. "Yeah? And what are you going to do about it?" Isaiah's gaze darkened. "I'm going to make them wish they had killed me with that fire." Marcus exhaled sharply. "Zay, man, you can't take these people on alone." Isaiah looked up. "Watch me." Isaiah knew that wars weren't won with brute force alone. They were won with strategy. He spent the next several days watching, listening, learning. At night, he moved like a shadow through Braxton, unseen, unnoticed. He memorized the gang's patterns, who they talked to, where they went, who they feared. He identified their weak spots, the ones who drank too much, the ones who let their guard down. And most importantly, he found their headquarters. "You're out of your damn mind," Rachel Carter said. She stood with her arms crossed, watching Isaiah with a mix of frustration and reluctant admiration. "You want me to help you expose the Iron Fangs?" she asked. "They'll kill me." Isaiah leaned forward. "They've already tried to kill me." Rachel hesitated. Isaiah pushed. "They run this town, Rachel. The sheriff won't do anything. The people are too scared. But you have a voice. People listen to you." She swallowed hard. "And what happens when they come for me?" Isaiah's eyes were cold steel. "They won't." Rachel stared at him. There was something about the way he said it, something that sent a chill down her spine. Finally, she sighed. "Fine," she said. "But if I die, I'm haunting you." Isaiah smirked. "Deal." That night, Isaiah sat on the rooftop across from the pit, the seedy bar where the Iron Fangs ran their business. He adjusted the scope on his binoculars, tracking movements. Inside, Caleb Hastings sat at the back table, laughing with his men. The king in his castle. Isaiah lowered the binoculars and smiled. It was time to remind Caleb of one simple fact. This town didn't belong to him. And before this war was over, Caleb Hastings would learn exactly who he had started a fight with. The night was quiet, but Isaiah was anything but still. In the world of war, silence wasn't peace. It was a trap waiting to be sprung. Isaiah crouched behind the dumpster, across the street from the pit, his breathing even, his pulse steady. Through the narrow alley, he could see Caleb Hastings, sitting like a king at his usual table. Around him, his gang laughed, drank, and bragged about their latest reign of terror. They thought they were untouchable. Isaiah was about to teach them otherwise. For the past 3 days, Isaiah had watched them. He memorized their habits, what time they arrived, what time they left, who carried weapons, who was weak. He knew their routines better than they did, because Isaiah wasn't just watching, he was hunting. Isaiah had spent 2 decades as a Navy SEAL. He had taken down cartels, warlords, and terrorists in some of the deadliest regions on Earth. But this was personal, and these men had no idea what was coming for them. Isaiah didn't want to just take out the Iron Fangs. He wanted to dismantle them from the inside out. He needed to cut their funding, their connections, their protection. And to do that, he needed a lead. That's where Rachel came in. Rachel sat across from him, in the dimly lit back booth of a rundown diner, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. You do realize what you're asking me to do, right? She said, voice low but sharp. Isaiah leaned forward. Yes. Rachel exhaled, rubbing her forehead. Look, I get it. These guys are scum. But Caleb Hastings isn't just some thug. He has cops on his payroll, politicians too. If I start digging, I'll have a target on my back. Isaiah's eyes were steady, cold. You already do. She swallowed hard. Jesus. Isaiah slid a flash drive across the table. I need you to find out who funds them, who supplies them, who protects them. I need names. Rachel hesitated, then took it. I'll see what I can find, she murmured. Isaiah nodded. Be careful. Rachel laughed dryly. That's the thing, Cole. Careful doesn't stop bullets. That night, Isaiah shadowed one of Caleb's top enforcers, Bobby Trask. Bobby was a loud, arrogant bruiser, always looking for a fight. But more importantly, he was careless. Isaiah followed him from the pit to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. He watched as Bobby met with two men in suits, men who didn't belong to the gang. Isaiah photographed everything. This wasn't just a gang anymore. This was an operation, and Isaiah was about to take it apart. 3 nights later, Bobby stumbled out of the pit, drunk and alone. Isaiah moved like a shadow, striking with military precision. A hand over the mouth, a twist of the wrist, a swift chokehold. Bobby never saw it coming. When he woke up, he was tied to a chair in an abandoned shack on the outskirts of town. Isaiah stood over him, arms crossed. Wake up, Bobby. Bobby groaned, blinking against the harsh light. What the? Isaiah grabbed a crowbar, tapping it lightly against the ground. Let's have a little chat. It didn't take long. Isaiah didn't need brutality to get answers. He just needed pressure. Bobby was a coward. The moment Isaiah mentioned cutting a deal with the feds, Bobby broke. He spilled everything. Who funded them, who they answered to, and most importantly, who Caleb was afraid of. Rachel was waiting for him when he returned to Marcus's garage. She was pale, gripping a folder in her hands. You're not gonna believe this, she whispered. Isaiah took the folder. Inside was a photo of a man in a suit, a high-ranking state senator, one who publicly condemned violence, one who pretended to be an ally, one who was secretly pulling the strings behind Caleb Hastings. Isaiah exhaled slowly. Well, he muttered, this just got interesting. The next morning, Caleb Hastings woke up to find a note pinned to his front door. It was simple. 4 words. You're running out of time. Caleb's hands shook as he read it. For the first time in his miserable life, he felt fear. And he should have. Because Isaiah Cole wasn't playing their game anymore. He was rewriting the rules. The town was silent. But in the darkness, war was brewing. Isaiah had spent years on the battlefield. But this was different. This wasn't some faraway country. This was his home. And he wasn't fighting for orders. He was fighting for justice. The Iron Fangs thought they were untouchable. Tonight, Isaiah was about to show them how wrong they were. Isaiah moved like a shadow, his footsteps silent against the damp earth. Through his binoculars, he watched the gang's hideout, a rotting barn just outside town, where Caleb's men stored guns, money, and secrets. Tonight, that was all going up in flames. He tapped his earpiece. Rachel, you in position? Rachel's voice crackled through the line. I'm set. Cameras rolling from a distance, she sat in her car, recording everything. This wasn't just about taking the gang down. This was about exposing them. Marcus? Isaiah whispered. Marcus's deep voice came through. 2 minutes out. Just say the word. Isaiah smiled. It was time. Inside the barn, 5 Iron Fangs members sat around a poker table, laughing loudly. Their leader for the night, Ray Bowers, leaned back in his chair, counting a thick stack of bills. That was too easy, Ray chuckled, slamming a beer down. That old couple barely put up a fight. The men laughed. They didn't hear the faint creak of a door opening. They didn't see the black figures slipping through the shadows. And by the time they noticed, it was too late. The first man went down without a sound, Isaiah's arm snapping around his throat like a vice. The second turned, only to get slammed against a wooden beam, his head bouncing off the splintered surface. Ray barely had time to reach for his gun before Isaiah ripped the table forward, slamming it into his chest. Cards and money exploded into the air. The remaining two gang members scrambled for their weapons. But Isaiah moved too fast. A quick jab to the ribs, a crushing elbow to the jaw. And just like that, it was over. The 5 men lay unconscious, their weapons kicked to the corner. Isaiah stood in the wreckage, breathing steadily. Then he grabbed Ray by the collar, dragging him up. Ray groaned, eyes fluttering open. He found himself tied to a chair, a rope cutting into his wrists. Across from him, Isaiah crouched, calm and deadly. Ray spat blood, sneering. "You think this scares me?" Isaiah's eyes were cold. "No," he said, "but Caleb will be." Then he pulled out his knife. Ray flinched. Isaiah didn't cut him. He didn't need to. Instead, he carved a message into the wooden table right in front of Ray's face. 4 words. "Tell Caleb I'm coming." Ray stared at it, sweat dripping down his temple. Isaiah leaned in. "You have 1 hour before the cops get here," he murmured. "Run." Then he was gone, slipping into the night. An hour later, Caleb Hastings stood in the destroyed barn, fists clenched. His gang members whispered nervously. This isn't normal," one muttered. "This wasn't some drunk fight. This was military." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Find him," he growled, "and bring me his head." One of his men hesitated. "There's more, boss." He handed Caleb a phone. Caleb pressed play. Rachel's voice filled the barn, crisp and clear. "Tonight, we saw a shift in power. The Iron Fangs have ruled this town through fear, but fear only works on those who don't fight back. And one man, one former Navy SEAL, is about to bring justice." The gang members looked at each other, nervous. The world was watching now. Caleb Hastings had built his empire in the shadows. Isaiah Cole was dragging him into the light, and that was a war Caleb couldn't win. That night, Caleb made his move. He needed to send a message, to show Isaiah he wasn't afraid, to break him. So he did the one thing he knew would get Isaiah's attention. He took Jamal. Marcus's shouts of panic rang through the garage as Isaiah walked in. "They took my son," Marcus gasped, gripping Isaiah's arms. "Caleb's men. They grabbed him after school. They left a note." Isaiah's fingers tightened around the paper. "Come alone, or the kid dies." A slow, burning rage settled in his chest. They thought they were in control. They thought this would break him. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Isaiah folded the note. Then, for the first time since coming home, he smiled. It was a cold, dangerous smile. One that said, they just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The night air was thick with tension. The smell of gasoline and burnt wood still lingered from Isaiah's earlier strike against the Iron Fangs. But now, the fight had changed. This wasn't just about sending a message anymore. This was about saving a life. Jamal, Marcus's son, a 10-year-old boy with a bright smile and a love for comic books, had been snatched from the streets by Caleb's men. And Isaiah knew exactly what that meant. The clock was ticking. Marcus was pacing back and forth, his hands clenched into tight fists. "They said to come alone," he muttered, voice shaking. "If I call the cops..." Isaiah placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Cops won't help. We know that. Marcus took a breath. So what do we do? Isaiah's face hardened. We find him fast. He pulled out a burner phone and dialed Sophia Lee, an old contact from his SEAL days. I need a favor, he said when she picked up. Sophia chuckled. You don't call for years. And now? You need something? It's urgent. Sophia heard the steel in his voice and didn't argue. What do you need? Access to street cams, traffic feeds, anything within 10 miles of Hazel Creek, Isaiah said. A kid's been taken. Sophia didn't hesitate. Sending you a link now. Check your laptop. Isaiah pulled out his military-grade tablet and opened the encrypted link Sophia had sent. Within seconds, hundreds of camera feeds filled the screen. Rachel leaned in. Can you track them? Isaiah's fingers moved quickly, scanning the footage, rewinding timestamps. He was searching for a van, a black SUV with tinted windows. Then, there. He found it. At exactly 4:32 p.m., a black SUV sped through a red light, heading towards the abandoned textile factory on the outskirts of town. Isaiah clenched his jaw. That's where they are. Marcus exhaled, a mix of relief and fear. Then let's go get my son. Isaiah nodded. Gear up. The abandoned textile factory loomed in the darkness, a skeleton of rusted metal and shattered glass. Isaiah crouched near the entrance, his movements silent as death. Inside, Caleb's men laughed and drank, confident that Isaiah wouldn't dare come for the boy. They had no idea they were already dead men walking. Isaiah tapped his earpiece. Rachel, keep the camera rolling. The world is gonna see this. Rachel, positioned in a car a few blocks away, nodded. Got it. Marcus whispered, What's the plan? Isaiah's SEAL instincts took over. We go in quiet, fast, no mistakes. Marcus gritted his teeth. And if they try to hurt Jamal? Isaiah's voice was ice cold. They won't live long enough to regret it. Isaiah slipped inside first, moving through the shadows. He counted 6 gang members, all armed, all relaxed. Big mistake. One of them turned. Isaiah struck like a viper, wrapping an arm around his throat and lowering him to the ground without a sound. 5 left. Marcus moved in behind Isaiah, his breathing heavy but controlled. From the next room, they heard Jamal's voice, scared but defiant. You think my uncle is scared of you? The boy spat. He's coming for me. One of the gang members chuckled. Let him come. He won't leave this place alive. Isaiah's fingers tightened around his knife. Wrong. Isaiah struck fast. A swift jab to the throat. One man went down. A knife flicked out. A silent cut across the tendons. Another collapsed, unable to scream. By the time the others realized what was happening, it was already too late. Marcus, filled with rage, rushed forward, tackling a gang member to the ground, throwing wild punches. Isaiah moved with precision, dodging a knife swipe before snapping a man's arm like a twig. The last one tried to run. Isaiah caught him by the collar and slammed him into the wall. The man gasped for air. Please. Isaiah's voice was calm. Where's the kid? The man pointed towards a locked storage room. Isaiah let him drop to the floor. Run! The gang members scrambled out, slipping on blood, as he disappeared into the night. Isaiah turned to the storage room and kicked the door open. Inside, Jamal sat on the floor, hands tied, his eyes wide. Uncle Isaiah, he whispered. Isaiah knelt down, untying the ropes. Let's go home, kid. Jamal clung to Marcus as they drove away. The boy was safe, but Isaiah knew this wasn't over. Caleb wouldn't let this slide, and Isaiah wasn't about to wait for the next attack. He pulled out his knife, flipping it between his fingers. "I'm done playing defense," he muttered. Rachel, still recording, gave him a curious look. "So what now?" Isaiah's eyes burned with a cold fire. "Now," he smirked. "Now, we take the fight to them." The town of Hazel Creek woke up to a storm of whispers and fear. The Iron Fangs had been outplayed, outmaneuvered, and outmatched by a single man. Isaiah Cole had walked into their den, rescued a child, and left without a scratch. The gang had been humiliated, and now the town was forced to choose a side. At Millie's Diner, the town's only local gathering spot, people spoke in hushed voices. "I heard he took down 5 of them," an old farmer muttered. "More like 6, his friend corrected. "And Caleb Hastings is furious." At the counter, Sheriff Jim Rowley took a slow sip of his coffee. His badge caught the morning sunlight, but his expression was dark. Across from him, Caleb Hastings sat fuming, his knuckles white as he gripped his cup. "You need to handle this," Caleb hissed, "or I will." Rowley's jaw tightened. "I told you before, Caleb, this town don't need no extra heat. That SEAL ain't some random thug. He's trained. He's dangerous." Caleb leaned in, voice dripping with hatred. "Then you'd better find a way to make him disappear." Rowley didn't reply. He was already working on it. Marcus stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching the morning unfold. The town had changed overnight. Some people, mostly the black families who had suffered under the Iron Fangs, stood taller, their eyes filled with newfound hope. Others, business owners, factory managers, and old money families, looked nervous. They had lived under Caleb's control for years, and now everything was being shaken. And then there were those who looked angry. White men in work boots and dusty jeans, their faces red with frustration, whispered among themselves, "This town don't need outsiders. He should have never come back. Cole thinks he's some kind of hero." The lines were drawn, and Isaiah knew it. Isaiah sat in Marcus's living room, Rachel across from him, typing furiously on her laptop. "The whole country is talking about you," she said, glancing at her screen. "You've gone viral." Isaiah frowned. "That's not necessarily a good thing." Rachel smirked. "For you? Maybe not. But for this town? It means they can't ignore what's happening anymore." She turned the screen toward him. On the news, a major headline flashed across the screen. "Former Navy SEAL takes on white supremacist gang in small southern town." A video played, a grainy leaked clip of Isaiah rescuing Jamal, recorded from Rachel's hidden camera. Isaiah sighed. "Caleb's gonna double down." Rachel nodded. "He already has." She slid a printed-out document across the table. Isaiah scanned it, his expression darkening. "The Iron Fangs are calling in backup," she explained. "Mercenaries, some with military backgrounds." Isaiah leaned back. His fingers drummed against the table. "They want a war." His eyes burned with a cold fire. "Then let's give them one." By noon, Hazel Creek was a battleground of opinions. Some people spoke out in support of Isaiah. "He's doing what the law won't," a man declared outside the local church. Others defended Caleb and the Iron Fangs. "This town was just fine before Cole showed up," a factory owner grumbled. And then there were those caught in between, people afraid to choose a side, knowing that who they supported could determine their future. At the town square, a protest broke out. Signs were raised. Voices shouted. Some called for justice. Others called for Isaiah's head. And watching from the shadows, Caleb Hastings smiled. The sun had barely set when the first attack came. A Molotov cocktail crashed through the window of Rachel's car, setting it ablaze. Marcus's barbershop was vandalized, its windows shattered, and then A bullet tore through the night, shattering the window of Marcus's house. Jamal screamed. Isaiah was already moving. He tackled Marcus to the ground, just as another shot rang out. "Down!" he barked. Rachel dove behind the couch, her heart hammering. Isaiah's trained ears locked onto the direction of the shots. Across the street, two gang members were retreating into the darkness, rifles in hand. Isaiah grabbed his sidearm, a silenced Glock 19, and sprinted after them. The first man never saw him coming. Isaiah slammed him against a brick wall, his forearm pinning the man's throat. "Who gave the order?" The gang member coughed. "Screw you." Isaiah didn't flinch. Wrong answer. He twisted the man's arm back, just enough to make him scream. "Caleb," he gasped. "Caleb told us to—" A gunshot rang out. The man went limp. Isaiah dropped to the ground, rolling behind a dumpster, just as another shot whizzed past. The second gang member was on the roof, sniper rifle in hand. But Isaiah was faster. He grabbed the fallen man's rifle and fired. One shot. A scream. The shooter tumbled off the roof, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Isaiah didn't waste time. He grabbed his phone and called Rachel. "Get Marcus and Jamal somewhere safe. Now." Rachel's voice was tight. "What about you?" Isaiah's eyes darkened. "I'm ending this tonight." Across town, Caleb Hastings poured himself a glass of whiskey, his hand shaking slightly. The Iron Fangs had controlled Hazel Creek for years, but now everything was falling apart. His men were afraid. His operations were being exposed, and Isaiah Cole was still standing. The front door burst open. Sheriff Rowley stormed in. "This has gone too far," he hissed. "We're getting attention from the feds, Caleb." Caleb smirked. "Then maybe it's time we send them a message." He pulled a burner phone from his pocket and dialed a number. A deep voice answered. "Is the offer still open?" Caleb asked. The voice chuckled. "Depends. You ready to go nuclear?" Caleb's eyes gleamed. "Oh, I'm ready." By morning, Hazel Creek was on high alert. Businesses boarded up their windows. Parents kept their children home from school. Isaiah stood on Marcus's porch, watching it all. Rachel walked up beside him. "They're bringing in real muscle now," she said. "Military-trained guys." Isaiah nodded. "Then we need to move first." Rachel frowned. "What do you mean?" Isaiah turned to her, his expression deadly serious. "I mean, no more hiding." He grabbed his combat knife and tucked it into his belt. "We're going after Caleb Hastings." Rachel's breath caught. Tonight, the sun was setting over Hazel Creek, casting long shadows across the town. The tension in the air was almost suffocating. Isaiah Cole stood outside Marcus's house, his eyes scanning the horizon, like a predator surveying his territory. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a storm waiting to break loose. Inside the church, a group of townspeople had gathered. Some whispered prayers, others exchanged nervous glances. Pastor Eli, an old friend of Isaiah's late mother, stood at the front, gripping the podium. His voice was heavy with emotion. "This town has been in the grip of fear for too long," he said, looking over the congregation. "But the question remains, what will we do now? Will we stand, or will we cower?" A woman in the back raised her voice. "What can we do against men like them?" From the shadows of the room, a voice cut through the silence. "We fight." The crowd turned to see Isaiah standing at the entrance. His presence was like a blade slicing through doubt. Not with guns, not with hate, but with truth, unity, and the one thing men like Caleb Hastings fear the most: exposure. Rachel Carter, seated in the front row, gave him a nod. She had already started that war in the press, and the pressure was building fast. But Isaiah knew words alone wouldn't be enough. Caleb Hastings thought he was untouchable. For years, he had built his empire in Hazel Creek, with fear and silence, but that changed tonight. Isaiah moved through the night like a ghost. Using SEAL tactics, he infiltrated Caleb's compound, an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. Inside, the Iron Fangs were drinking, laughing, celebrating their attacks on Isaiah's allies. They had no idea he was already inside the building with them. Isaiah struck like a phantom. One by one, he neutralized guards using his knife and silenced pistol. The first man never even saw him coming. A quick slice to the throat, and he was gone. The second tried to scream, but Isaiah's grip cut off the sound. By the time the gang realized something was wrong, it was too late. Isaiah stood in the middle of the room, their nightmare made flesh. "Where's Caleb?" he demanded, his voice low and lethal. One gang member lunged at him. Bad mistake. Isaiah caught the man's wrist, twisted snap. The gang member collapsed, screaming. The others stared in horrified silence. Isaiah raised his gun. "I'm only going to ask one more time." A trembling man pointed to a door in the back. Isaiah moved. Isaiah kicked the door open, but Caleb was already waiting. And he wasn't alone. Two mercenaries stood beside him, men with combat experience, military training, and cold, dead eyes. Isaiah recognized them immediately. Black Ops, former soldiers. Caleb grinned. "You thought you were the only one with military friends." Isaiah didn't hesitate. He lunged forward. The room exploded into chaos. The first mercenary swung, but Isaiah sidestepped with SEAL precision. He countered with a brutal elbow strike to the man's temple, knocking him out cold. The second mercenary was faster, grabbing Isaiah from behind. Isaiah twisted, using the momentum, flipping the man over his shoulder. They crashed into the desk. Caleb watched, his smirk fading. He had underestimated Isaiah, and now he was watching his best men fall like dominoes. Isaiah turned to face Caleb. Just the two of them now. Caleb reached for his gun. Isaiah was faster. He grabbed Caleb's wrist, twisting until the gun clattered to the floor. Then, one devastating punch to the jaw. Caleb staggered back, dazed. Isaiah grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against the wall. "You think you run this town?" Isaiah growled. "You're nothing but a coward." Caleb spat blood. "You think you won?" He laughed. "The sheriff is still mine. The cops are still mine. You can't win." Isaiah leaned in close. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, voice calm and deadly. "Your time is up." And then, in the distance, sirens. Caleb's eyes widened. Rachel had done her job. The feds were coming. Isaiah smirked. "No more hiding, Caleb." And with that, he knocked him out cold. By dawn, the news was everywhere. FBI raid takes down racist gang leader in Hazel Creek. Sheriff Rowley had vanished, his connections to the gang exposed. The Iron Fangs, scattered, broken, leaderless. And Isaiah? He stood in the wreckage, looking at the town that had once rejected him. Now people looked at him with something different. Respect. Marcus walked up, clapping him on the shoulder. "You did it, brother." Isaiah shook his head. "We did it." Rachel smirked. "You're a legend now. You know that?" Isaiah sighed. "I didn't come here to be a legend." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Then why did you come back?" Isaiah looked out at the town, at the people, at the future. "To finish what my mother started." The town of Hazel Creek had changed overnight. The Iron Fangs were in shambles, their leader, Caleb Hastings, in federal custody. The once untouchable sheriff had fled, leaving behind a power vacuum. But Isaiah Cole knew this wasn't over. Evil doesn't just disappear, it adapts. And tonight, Hazel Creek would face its final reckoning. The local diner was packed with nervous whispers. People had seen the news. They had watched as the FBI stormed the gang's compound, arresting members left and right. But there was one problem. Not all of them were caught. A group of Iron Fang's loyalists had gone underground, and rumor had it, they were plotting revenge. Marcus Reed sat across from Isaiah, his face tight with worry. "They ain't done, man," he muttered, keeping his voice low. "Caleb's behind bars, but his boys, they're still out there, and they're pissed." Isaiah nodded grimly. "I know." Rachel Carter, seated next to them, tapped her phone screen. "I've been digging. There's still a network helping them. Money, weapons, safe houses." She looked up. "And I think I know where they're regrouping." Isaiah had fought terrorists in the Middle East, cartels in South America, and warlords in Africa. But this was personal. Under the cover of night, he moved like a phantom, slipping into his makeshift hideout, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Inside, he laid out his gear: tactical vest, combat knife, silenced pistol, C4 explosives, a custom rifle built for precision and speed. He wasn't just going after the gang. He was going to end them. For good. Rachel had given him an address, a remote hunting lodge deep in the woods. That's where the last of the Iron Fangs were hiding. Isaiah moved silently through the trees, his SEAL instincts kicking in. He spotted 4 men patrolling the perimeter, armed with military-grade rifles. These weren't just small-town racists anymore. Someone was backing them. Someone powerful. Isaiah gritted his teeth. He'd deal with that later. For now, he had a mission. One guard stood just outside the main cabin, smoking a cigarette. He never saw Isaiah coming. A quick knife to the throat, and he dropped silently. The next 2, a double headshot with a silenced pistol. The last guard spun around, rifle raised. But Isaiah was faster. He grabbed the man's arm, twisted, and snapped the elbow in one fluid motion. The guard screamed, but Isaiah ended it fast. Now, it was time for the main event. Inside the lodge, the gang was celebrating, laughing over beers. Then, boom! The front door exploded inward, and Isaiah moved like lightning. Bang! First man down. Bang! Second man didn't even get a chance to react. A third lunged at him, swinging a crowbar. Isaiah dodged, grabbed the man's wrist, and slammed his face into the table. The leader of the remaining gang members, a hulking man with a shaved head, reached for a shotgun. But Isaiah was already there. A brutal kick to the knee, a crushing elbow to the jaw, and the man crashed to the floor, unconscious. It was over. The last of the Iron Fangs were finished. As Isaiah searched the hideout, he found something disturbing. Documents, blueprints, names. This wasn't just a small-town gang. The Iron Fangs were part of something bigger, a national movement backed by corrupt politicians and powerful figures. Rachel, who had arrived after the dust settled, picked up a folder. She paled. Isaiah. This goes all the way to the state government. Isaiah's jaw clenched. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. The sun had barely risen over Hazel Creek when the town's silence was shattered. Sirens, flashing red and blue lights filled the streets, and at the center of it all, Isaiah Cole, handcuffed, surrounded, outnumbered. Sheriff Jim Rowley had made his move. Isaiah had known this was coming. The system was always rigged. It wasn't enough to take down the Iron Fangs. The real enemy was corruption itself. And Sheriff Rowley? He was a man desperate to hold on to power. So he did what every coward does. He framed the real hero. Isaiah was dragged through the town square, his hands locked behind his back, his face stoic as ever. People watched in shock. Some whispered. Others stood in silent outrage. They knew this was wrong, but no one dared to step forward. Not yet. Rachel had been one step ahead. The moment Isaiah was arrested, she went into overdrive. She stormed into the local news station, her camera crew already rolling. Live on air, she exposed everything: the sheriff's ties to the Iron Fangs, the payoffs, the cover-ups, the FBI reports proving Isaiah's innocence. This isn't just an attack on one man. Rachel's voice rang out. This is an attack on justice itself. People started watching, and then they started marching. The town had been afraid for too long. But now they were angry. It started with Marcus Reed, then his wife, then the local pastor, then dozens more. They marched to the sheriff's office, demanding Isaiah's release, and inside his office, Sheriff Rowley was sweating bullets. Rowley slammed his fist onto his desk. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had underestimated Isaiah, underestimated Rachel, underestimated the power of truth. His phone rang. He snatched it up. A familiar voice spoke on the other end. "You've lost control, Jim." Rowley's face drained of color. Because the man on the line, he wasn't just some small-town thug. He was someone far more dangerous, someone who didn't tolerate failure. And the message was clear: fix this, or be removed. Inside the holding cell, Isaiah sat calmly. He had been trained for interrogations, captivity, psychological warfare. Oh, this question mark. This was nothing. Sheriff Rowley walked in, trying to mask his fear with arrogance. "You think you're untouchable, Cole?" Rowley sneered. Isaiah didn't answer. He just stared. The kind of stare that made men question their own strength. And in that silence, Rowley knew he had already lost. Rachel's broadcast went national. The FBI was forced to act. The mayor, under investigation. The local police force, dismantled. And Sheriff Rowley, he was about to face his own downfall. FBI agents stormed into the station. "We'll take it from here." Rowley barely had time to react before they slapped the cuffs on him. For the first time in his life, the hunter had become the hunted. As Isaiah stepped outside, the town erupted in cheers. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate, because this war, it wasn't over yet. He locked eyes with Rachel, and then with Marcus. "We took out the trash," Isaiah muttered. "But the people pulling the strings?" Rachel nodded. "They're still out there." And Isaiah knew exactly what he had to do next. A storm was brewing over Hazel Creek. Not just in the sky, but in the streets, in the hearts of the people, in the war that was reaching its climax. Isaiah Cole had faced enemies more ruthless, more trained, more deadly than the Iron Fangs. But what made this different? This was personal. This was his home. And tonight, he was going to take it back. Isaiah stood at the highest ridge overlooking the Iron Fangs' hideout, an abandoned steel mill on the outskirts of town. Rust-covered walls, broken windows, a fortress of criminals and corruption. Inside, Caleb Hastings had gathered the last of his men. Desperate, armed, willing to die. Isaiah didn't expect them to surrender. And honestly, he didn't plan on giving them the chance. Marcus handed Isaiah a folded piece of paper. "These are the last names we have," Marcus whispered. "Names of men in power, funding the Iron Fangs. Names of men who had kept Hazel Creek in chains for generations." Isaiah memorized every single one. Because tonight those names would be etched into history, and not in the way those men expected. Isaiah moved silently. His mind wasn't in Hazel Creek anymore. It was in the jungles of war zones, the mountains of enemy territory, the nights of silent combat. He planted charges along the facility, not to kill, but to control, to force the enemy exactly where he wanted them. The moment they stepped outside, they'd be stepping into his battlefield. Meanwhile, Rachel was in position. She had hacked into the gang's private network, live streaming everything to millions of viewers across the country. The world was watching the corruption, watching the terror unfold, watching as one man went against an army. And as the numbers climbed into the millions, Rachel whispered to herself, "This is how we win." Isaiah launched a flashbang through a broken window. Boom! Screams. Chaos. The Iron Fangs scrambled, grabbing weapons, shouting orders, but it was already too late. Because Isaiah was inside. One by one, he took them down. No wasted movement, no hesitation. A man lunged with a knife. Isaiah twisted his wrist, sending the blade into the attacker's own leg. Another aimed a rifle. Isaiah fired first. The gang wasn't ready for a Navy SEAL. Caleb Hastings stood in the center of the steel mill, a shotgun in his hands. But more than that, a dead man's look in his eyes. Isaiah approached, calm and slow. "You should have killed me when you had the chance," Caleb sneered. Isaiah's voice was low, controlled, deadly. "You should have never touched my home." Caleb fired. Boom! Isaiah dodged, sliding behind a pillar. Caleb was breathing hard, sweating, panicked. Isaiah was calm, because he had already won. He had led Caleb exactly where he needed him. Outside, sirens screamed. The FBI, the National Guard, news helicopters, the whole world was watching. Rachel's live stream had reached 50 million viewers. There was no escape. The building was surrounded. Isaiah stepped forward. "Drop the gun, Caleb." For the first time in his life, Caleb Hastings looked afraid, because he knew this wasn't just the end of his gang. This was the end of everything he stood for. Isaiah could have killed him, but he didn't, because justice wasn't about revenge. It was about breaking the cycle. And tonight, that cycle ended. He knocked the gun from Caleb's hands. The sheriff's former deputies stormed in, pinning Caleb to the ground. His reign of terror over. As Isaiah walked out of the mill, the town was waiting. Marcus, Rachel, the people who had once lived in fear, now they stood tall, because they weren't afraid anymore, because they had won. And Isaiah, he wasn't just a soldier. Oh, he was a legend. And his war was finally over. The night had been long. The battle had been brutal. But in the end, justice had prevailed. The Iron Fangs were no more. The corrupt sheriff was exposed. And Caleb Hastings, he was in handcuffs. But for Isaiah Cole, the war wasn't over yet. Because victory wasn't just about taking down the enemy. It was about making sure they never came back. As the sun rose over Hazel Creek, the town woke up to a new reality. For the first time in decades, the streets were safe. Federal agents swarmed the town, arresting corrupt officers, seizing illegal weapons, shutting down every last piece of the Iron Fangs empire. It was a purge, and Isaiah made sure it was thorough. The cameras were rolling as Caleb Hastings was dragged toward a waiting FBI van. His face was bruised, his eyes filled with hatred. But there was something else, something new. Fear. The arrogance was gone. The power was gone. All that remained was a broken man. And Isaiah, he stood there, arms crossed, watching. Caleb met his gaze. "You think this changes anything?" Caleb growled. Isaiah didn't blink. "I don't think. I know." And as Caleb was shoved into the van, Isaiah whispered, "You'll never hurt anyone again." Sheriff Jim Rowley had spent years covering for the Iron Fangs, protecting them, feeding their power. But not anymore. Rachel's expose had gone viral. National news had picked it up. And now, the entire country was watching. As the FBI agents led the sheriff out in handcuffs, reporters shouted questions. Did you take bribes? How long have you been working with the Iron Fangs? Do you regret betraying your town? Rowley kept his head down, refusing to answer. But Isaiah, he spoke for him. He let evil thrive, Isaiah said, his voice steady. Now, he'll pay for it. The cameras caught every word, and the whole world heard it. With the Iron Fangs gone, Hazel Creek began to heal. People came out of their homes. Businesses reopened. Families returned. For the first time in years, the town felt alive. And at the center of it all was Isaiah. People looked at him differently now, not with fear, not with suspicion, but with respect. Because he didn't just save them. He gave them back their future. A week later, the town square was packed. Reporters, civilians, even government officials. Everyone had come for one reason: to hear the man who saved Hazel Creek. Isaiah stepped up to the podium. Rachel stood nearby, microphone in hand. Marcus was beside her, arms crossed, nodding in support. Isaiah looked over the crowd. Then he spoke. I didn't come back to Hazel Creek looking for a fight, he began. I came back to find my home. A hush fell over the crowd. But what I found was a town held hostage by fear, a town where justice was for sale, a town where people were forced to run, hide, or suffer. He took a deep breath. Not anymore. Applause erupted. Rachel smiled. Marcus raised his fist in solidarity. But Isaiah wasn't finished. I was trained to fight wars overseas, he said. But what do you do when the war is at your doorstep? When the enemy is your own people? When corruption has poisoned the place you love? His voice grew stronger. You fight. You stand up. You refuse to let evil win. The crowd roared. Tears filled the eyes of some. And Isaiah? He stood tall, because for the first time in years, he felt at peace. 2 months later, a gavel slammed down in a federal courtroom. Life in prison. Caleb Hastings didn't flinch. He had lost everything: his gang, his power, his name. And as the guards led him away, he looked up at the visitors' gallery. Isaiah was there, watching. Caleb gave him one last glare. Isaiah didn't say a word. He didn't need to, because Caleb knew. Justice had caught up with him, and there was no escape. Hazel Creek was no longer a town of fear. It was a town of hope, a town where people stood together, where corruption had been burned away. And Isaiah? He wasn't just the man who had fought back. He was the man who won. As he walked through the streets, he saw children laughing, businesses thriving, families rebuilding, and he knew his mission was complete. But his purpose was just beginning. The scars of battle remained. The echoes of gunfire had faded, but the wounds, both seen and unseen, would take time to heal. But Hazel Creek was alive again. No more fear, no more oppression, no more iron fangs. And standing in the center of it all was the man who had given the town back its soul, Isaiah Cole. It started small. At first, people were hesitant. Decades of fear couldn't disappear overnight. But then, one by one, they stepped forward. Marcus Reed led the charge, rallying volunteers to clean up burned-out homes, broken storefronts, and vandalized streets. Rachel Carter used her national platform to gather donations, legal aid, and federal support for Black families who had been forced out of their homes. And Isaiah? He didn't stand on the sidelines. He picked up a hammer. He rebuilt with his own 2 hands the house that the Iron Fangs had burned down. He rebuilt it, not just for himself, but for the town. Because Hazel Creek wasn't just his past anymore. It was his future. Isaiah knew one truth: the real war is fought in the hearts of the next generation. So he took everything he had learned, from the Navy SEALs, from the battlefield, from life itself. And he created something new, a program, a place where young black kids could learn discipline, self-defense, leadership, and resilience. The town's old boxing gym, once abandoned, covered in graffiti, became a sanctuary, a place for kids to train, to grow, to become warriors in their own right, not with guns, not with violence, but with knowledge, strength, and self-worth. Isaiah stood before them, a living testament that they were not weak. They were not powerless. They could fight back, not with fists, but with their minds, their hearts, and their unbreakable spirit. And soon, the gym was full. Kids training, young men and women finding purpose, hope, and a future. And in the center of it all, Isaiah Cole, their mentor, their guide. One evening, as Isaiah was locking up the gym, he saw an old man waiting outside, thin, weathered, eyes full of pain and regret. Isaiah recognized him immediately. Mr. Lawson, his old high school history teacher, one of the few white men in Hazel Creek who had spoken up against the Iron Fangs years ago, who had warned Isaiah's mother about the danger she was in, but who had been powerless to stop it. The old man hesitated, then said, "I should have done more." Isaiah studied him for a long moment. Then he simply nodded. "You're here now." Lawson's eyes glistened with emotion. "I want to help," he said. "With the kids, with the school, with whatever I can." Isaiah clapped a hand on the old man's shoulder. "Then let's get to work." With Sheriff Jim Rowley gone, Hazel Creek needed new leadership. Someone just, someone honest. And for the first time in history, Hazel Creek elected a black police chief, Officer Terrence Williams, a man who had served with integrity, despite the corruption around him. At his swearing-in ceremony, Isaiah stood in the crowd, watching. As Chief Williams took his oath, he locked eyes with Isaiah and nodded, a silent promise that this town would never fall into darkness again. The government had taken notice of Isaiah's work, his leadership, his ability to fight. One afternoon, as he was finishing a training session at the gym, a black SUV pulled up. Two men stepped out, military suits, high-ranking. One of them extended his hand. "Isaiah Cole. The Navy still needs men like you." Isaiah stared at them for a long time. He thought about the war zones, the battles, the years spent fighting enemies on foreign soil. Then he looked back at Hazel Creek, at the kids in the gym, at the people rebuilding their lives. And he shook his head. "My fight is here." He turned and walked away, and never looked back. Rachel Carter's expose didn't stop with Hazel Creek. She wrote a best-selling book about the town's battle, about Isaiah's fight. The book was titled A Town Reborn, The Man Who Fought Back. It was a national sensation. And soon, the world knew Isaiah Cole's name, not as a soldier, not as a warrior, but as a leader, a protector, a symbol of resilience. One evening, Isaiah stood on the porch of his newly rebuilt home. Marcus sat beside him, sipping a beer. Rachel leaned against the railing, smiling. "You did it," she said. Isaiah exhaled. "No," he said. "We did it." Marcus chuckled. "Yeah, but you're the one they'll be writing about in the history books." Isaiah smirked. "Let them write whatever they want. We've still got work to do." And as the sun set over Hazel Creek, Isaiah Cole knew this was just the beginning, because the fight for justice never ends. But now, he wasn't fighting alone. He had a town behind him, a legacy ahead of him, and a future worth protecting. The battle was over, but the war wasn't. The war against fear, against injustice, against the shadows of the past that still clung to Hazel Creek like a ghostly presence. Isaiah Cole had won one fight, but he knew If he left, the town could slip back into the darkness, and that wasn't an option. The second time the government sent recruiters to Hazel Creek, Isaiah didn't even let them finish their pitch. "I told you," he said. "I'm done with war." One of the officers, a high-ranking Navy official, frowned. "You could do more out there, Isaiah. Bigger missions, bigger impact." Isaiah simply shook his head. "Not bigger, just different. My fight is here." The officer hesitated, then sighed. "Well, if you ever change your mind." Isaiah didn't let him finish. "I won't." The LV drove off, and Isaiah went back to work. Because Hazel Creek needed him more than the battlefield ever did. The changes didn't happen overnight. But they happened. The streets, once riddled with gang tags and destruction, were repainted, cleaned, reclaimed. Businesses, once shut down out of fear, reopened. Black families, once forced to leave, returned home. And the boxing gym? It wasn't just for training anymore. It became a safe haven, a place where kids, regardless of color, could come and learn discipline, self-defense, and leadership. A place where Marcus Reed started hosting youth programs, teaching young men how to handle themselves, stay out of trouble, and find purpose. And Rachel Carter? She turned the town's struggle into a national movement. Her book, A Town Reborn, The Man Who Fought Back, was everywhere. It sparked debates, discussions, and real policy changes about corruption, systemic racism, and the power of community resistance. Isaiah didn't care about the publicity, but he cared about one thing. People were listening, and that meant change was possible. One afternoon, Isaiah was in the gym, wrapping a pair of boxing gloves for a young boy, when a familiar face walked through the doors. A face he hadn't seen in 20 years. Commander David Marshall, his old SEAL instructor. A man who had pushed him past his limits. A man who had once told him, "A warrior's real mission starts when he puts down his weapon." Marshall looked around, nodding in approval. "You really did it, Cole. You turned this town around." Isaiah smirked. "Still a work in progress." Marshall crossed his arms. "So, you're not coming back?" Isaiah chuckled. "You already know the answer to that." The old commander sighed. "Yeah, I do." Then he extended his hand, not as a superior, not as a recruiter, but as a man paying respect to another. Isaiah shook it, and in that moment, he knew. He had finally found his real purpose. Rachel wasn't done fighting either. One evening, as Isaiah was closing up the gym, she walked in, holding a folder. "New story?" Isaiah asked, nodding toward the papers. Rachel sat on the edge of the boxing ring. Bigger than a story, a movement. She slid the folder across the mat. Inside were documents, proposals, funding requests. "Cities across the country are facing the same problem Hazel Creek did," she said. "We started something here. We can take it further." Isaiah glanced at the papers. The project was ambitious. It would require money, resources, time. But as he flipped through the pages, he saw something he couldn't ignore. The faces of kids like Jamal. Kids who needed someone to stand up for them. Isaiah exhaled, tossing the folder back to her. "You know this means more work for me, right?" Rachel grinned. "That's why I came to you?" Isaiah smirked. "All right," he said. "Let's build something bigger." The first town meeting in Hazel Creek's newly rebuilt community center was packed. People of all backgrounds filled the room. Black, white, Hispanic, families, business owners, young activists, even former police officers who had once looked the other way, now stood among them, ready to be part of the solution. Marcus stood at the podium, clearing his throat. "A year ago, this town was dying. Today, it's alive again. And we're just getting started." The crowd cheered, Rachel stepped forward. We're launching a new initiative, one that will make sure what happened here never happens anywhere else. And then Isaiah took the stage. For a long moment, he just looked at the people before him, people who had suffered, fought, and won. Then he spoke. This town doesn't belong to hate. It doesn't belong to fear. It belongs to you. And as long as we stand together, no one can take it from us again. The applause was deafening. And in that moment, Isaiah knew Hazel Creek was no longer just his home. It was his legacy. The weight of the past was finally lifting from Hazel Creek. But Isaiah Cole knew there was still work to be done. The scars of injustice ran deep, and change, real change, wasn't something that happened overnight. It had to be earned, fought for, and protected. Because even in victory, the battle never truly ends. One crisp autumn morning, Isaiah drove out to the old church cemetery on the outskirts of Hazel Creek. The sky was a shade of deep blue, the kind that made everything feel endless, a stark contrast to the weight in his chest. As he stepped out of his truck, the leaves crunched beneath his boots. He walked past the rows of headstones, stopping in front of the one that mattered most. Rebecca Cole, beloved mother, activist, fighter. Isaiah knelt down, brushing away a few fallen leaves from the base of the stone. For a moment, he just stared. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. I kept my promise. My Hazel Creek is free. He exhaled slowly, closing his eyes. And I'm staying. I won't run this time. A light breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the sound of distant wind chimes from the old church. Isaiah let himself believe, just for a second, that it was his mother answering back. With the iron fangs dismantled, the corrupt sheriff behind bars, and the town reclaiming its identity, Isaiah turned his focus to something greater, the next generation. The boxing gym that once stood as a training ground for young men to fight their way out of trouble became something more, a youth center, a place where kids could train, learn, and find purpose. Marcus Reed took charge, ensuring every child who walked through those doors was met with discipline and guidance. Jamal, once a boy who had nearly been lost to fear, became the gym's most dedicated student. And Isaiah? He was always there, watching, training, mentoring, teaching these kids that strength wasn't just about how hard you could hit. It was about knowing when not to fight, when to stand tall without throwing a punch, when to lead with wisdom, not anger. One afternoon, as Isaiah wrapped Jamal's hands for training, the boy looked up at him and asked, Were you scared back when they took me? Isaiah paused, tightening the bandage around the boy's knuckles. Yeah, he admitted. But being scared doesn't mean you stop moving. It means you move smarter. Jamal nodded, soaking in every word. Rachel Carter wasn't just writing stories anymore. She was changing laws. Her investigative work, paired with the evidence Isaiah had gathered, led to federal investigations into white supremacist networks across the country. Her book became a national bestseller, and she didn't stop there. With Isaiah's support, she launched the Hazel Creek Initiative, a movement dedicated to exposing and dismantling hate groups that operated in the shadows. One by one, towns like Hazel Creek started to fight back. People stood up, spoke out, refused to be intimidated. Because when one town rises, others follow. One evening, as Isaiah was locking up the gym, Marcus leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. You ever thought about running for office? Isaiah snorted. Me? In politics? Marcus smirked. Why not? People listen to you. Isaiah shook his head. I fight my battles in the open. I'm not made for backroom deals and handshakes. Marcus shrugged. Still, people need leaders who actually care. something to think about. Isaiah didn't answer, but the thought lingered, because Marcus was right. The fight wasn't just in the streets, it was in the laws, the systems, and maybe, just maybe, there was a different kind of war Isaiah needed to prepare for. On the 1-year anniversary of Hazel Creek's rebirth, the town gathered at the newly rebuilt community center. People of all backgrounds, all ages, stood together, stronger than ever. Marcus gave the opening speech. Rachel spoke about their movement, and then it was Isaiah's turn. He stepped onto the stage, scanning the crowd. He saw the faces of those he fought for, the elders who had endured decades of fear, the young kids who would never know that fear. And in that moment, he knew. His mother's fight had become his own. Isaiah took a deep breath. This town doesn't belong to hate. It doesn't belong to fear. It belongs to you. And as long as we stand together, no one can take it from us again. The applause was deafening. And in that moment, Isaiah knew Hazel Creek was no longer just his home. It was his legacy. As the sun set over Hazel Creek, Isaiah sat on the hood of his truck, watching the last of the town's celebration unfold. Rachel walked up beside him. "You thinking about what Marcus said?" she asked. Isaiah exhaled. "Yeah," she smirked. "Maybe you should." He glanced at her. "You really think I'd fit in that world?" Rachel laughed. "Number. But that's exactly why they need you." Isaiah was silent for a moment. Then he smirked. Because maybe, just maybe, his fight wasn't over yet. And just like that, Hazel Creek was never the same again. One man's return set off a chain reaction, a battle not just for survival, but for justice, for dignity, for home. But what would you have done in Isaiah's place? Would you have fought back? Would you have stayed and rebuilt? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because your voice matters. And if you've been with us through this journey, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. More stories are coming. Stories of courage, of resilience, of people who refuse to be broken. Because in the end, heroes don't just exist in books or movies. Sometimes they walk among us. Sometimes they fight in the shadows. And sometimes they change everything. Stay tuned, on fire.